And as I've been saying, I've been using the British Library has put up many of their scanned images of manuscripts. And so I've been using some of those. This is interesting because it's from a manuscript that has what's called the Targum in it. That's what I work in. That's why my email address and my website is called targuman.org. But it probably was not done by Jews, or at least not for Jews, because of the depiction of people and creatures. But what's in gold is the Hebrew Vayehi, the first word of Hebrew, of the Hebrew text, Vayehi Bayamei Shofetayim, in the days when the judges judged or judges ruled. But I love the medieval characters, the way you've got some humans, but you've also got some, bird-like creatures, and I don't know what all they are, but anyway. But in Hebrew, of course, you're not supposed to have a graven image. So hence, usually you'll find illuminated words like this, but you won't find the figures in it. All righty. Well, shall we open with a word of prayer?
Yes.
Yes.
Lord be with you.
Also
with you.
Let us pray. God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through your Son, Jesus. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Yeah.
And that's the prayer for the humanity from the back of the Book of Common Prayer. If anybody wants to find that again, there's some excellent prayers there, and for obvious reasons, praying that today. So here again, characters of God. We've talked about Adam and Eve, Rebecca and Jacob, and Moses, and today is Ruth and Naomi. Any questions before we get started? Anything about Moses or the past that you thought about and you go, Brady was totally wrong about that. I need to correct him. No, not yet. It'll come. I will say, I sent a note to Emery because for some reason I thought that the 4th of July weekend, which would be next weekend, we weren't having class. I'll be able to teach, but for some reason I thought Emery had said that, and he's just going to double check. So I'm sure they'll email and with the usual Sunday morning, but if they want us there, I'll be there. All right.
Thank you.
So yeah. All right. So here we are again with Ruth and Naomi. I sometimes loving kindness because the term chesed, the Hebrew term, which means something like loving kindness, chesed, is a dominant theme. It's actually not, after I put that on the title, it's actually not something I'm going to dwell on a whole lot. I did mention, or say again, I recently published a book on the Targum, the Aramaic version of the book of Ruth. So I've spent about 15 years writing about the biblical book of Ruth and its rabbinic interpretation. So it would be really easy for me to get lost in the details here. So feel free to just stop at any time, press me, think about other things, okay? All right, so let's set the scene here. The book begins by doing just that. It begins right with these first 5 verses, and it provides the context of the entire book for us. In the days when the judges ruled, literally in Hebrew, the judges judged, there's a repetition of that word. There was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Machlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Machlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So anything you note, first of all, in our close reading, what are some of the things that jump out to you about this text?
Names are hard to pronounce. Yeah.
Named, okay. Yeah, the H in what looks like Mahlon is actually a chet, so we would pronounce it Machlon. It's the same letter that's at the beginning of Chilion's name. It's only hard because I say it hard, you know. I hope everybody, yeah, go ahead.
I don't think that's true. I mean, those are hard names.
Well, and Orpah is actually a pretty hard name. Anybody know my favorite trivia about Orpah?
Oprah.
Oprah Winfrey is named after Orpah.
Just the reversal of the letters.
Yeah.
Isn't Ephrathite of the tribe of Ephraim?
No, this is Ephraim. So they are, so the Ephrathites were a sub-clan of the Levites.
Oh, okay. Oh.
I believe so. I've got to double check, to be honest with you. I say that with such great confidence, and I'm fairly confident, but you know how it is. Now it's like I used to really fret when I was doing my doctorate. I was working on Lamentations and the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. But I had this fear. It was almost like a mental block. I would go to write 586, and I would freeze. I'd be like, wait, is it 5? So I had this fear that I would fail my doctoral exam because I couldn't remember the date, 586 BCE. So anybody know what the name Bethlehem in Hebrew means?
House of bread.
So bread?
House of bread, that's right. Lechem means bread, but it also means just generically food. So it's the house of food. And any guesses as to why it was probably called that? Well, probably, what do we call the Midwest of our country because of all the grain?
Bread basket.
Bread basket.
Right. So Bethlehem was probably called Beit Lechem, the house of bread, because it was an area that was really pretty fertile, that they would regularly be able to produce the grain and things necessary for food and for eating. So we open right away with this contrast. So the setting is the day of the judges, and if you'd like, we can talk about when scholars think it may or may not have been written. But we're told there's a famine in the land that includes Bethlehem. So the land of Israel, but Bethlehem. So Bethlehem, which is usually full of food, a house of food, a house of bread, there's a famine in it. And so we have this man, Elimelech, with his wife and 2 sons, leaving in search of food, and they go to Moab. What is unique in particular in the Bible about Moab?
Moses' wife came from there.
No, she came from Midian. She was a Midianite.
Excuse me.
It's quite all right.
Wasn't
So
across the Sea of Galilee?
they were Transjordan, but the Moabites were sort of the quintessential enemies of Israel. And in fact, in Numbers, again, I'm looking to the sky, 25, I think, chapter 25, it says explicitly that no Moabites shall ever enter into the congregation of Israel because of the way they treated Israel when they were on their journey to the promised land. So all the way into the medieval period, when Jews want to write about their enemies, they will use the term Moabites. So Moabite is used to refer to Christians, it's used to refer to Romans, it's used to refer to Muslims, Ottomans, and so forth. So the Moabites are the quintessential enemy of Israel. And so here they're leaving the land of Israel, they're leaving the house of bread because it's a famine, but they're going to the enemy. Now they're in this time of famine, but notice the nature of Elimelech and Naomi's family. It is, we might say, full, because they have two sons, right? They've got an heir and a spare, as they used to say. Right? So they're leaving Israel in a time of famine, but they are entering, but they themselves are still full. So they get to Moab and they reside there. Now notice what I've already highlighted. If I had been clever, I would have made 2 different slides and I'd click now and it would be highlighted. But notice, how is Elimelech referred to here?
Husband of Naomi.
Right. His identity is based upon her. So we only have 2 books in the Bible named for women, Ruth and
Esther.
Esther. Very interesting books. I'm actually teaching a whole class this fall on both of these books. Scholarship around Ruth, for example, and women is very, very interesting. And I'll mention in passing when we get to Boaz. But there are certain features about the book of Ruth that are remarkable, and the role of men, or I argue the marginal role of men, is really quite remarkable, and it's indicated or flagged, predicted here, as it were, with this phrasing. Elimelech is the husband of Naomi. That's his only identity. So, by the way, what do you think is the primary tension in the book of Ruth? I should have started with this.
Well,
you may not. Go ahead.
I took it as possibly it's Gentiles versus Jews, maybe.
Yeah. There's definitely outsider insider issues here, right? With Moabite Israelite and Naomi being a refugee and immigrant, leaving her place of famine. What kind of famine that is, we'll talk about. One of the things I didn't, I tried to jump right in. I probably should have gone back to point out, right? How does Ruth end? It ends with a genealogy that takes us to whom?
Jesus. Or
Jesus.
David.
David, right?
Yeah.
Not Jesus yet. It takes us to David. So when scholars talk about when this might have been written and its likely context, there are 2 primary contexts that they tend to talk about. So it is set in the days of the judges. That's fine. But obviously it's written much later. It's written at least after the time of David. Otherwise, we don't have that, although it could be a colophon put on. But the point is, there's what is likely going on here. The tension that's within this book is that prohibition I mentioned in the book of Numbers, that a Moabite is not allowed to enter into the congregation of Israel. And yet David's great-great-grandmother is a Moabite. How is that allowed? Now, the other context scholars think it could potentially come from is after the exile, Ezra, the priest and scribe, comes back and they're from Babylon. They're rebuilding Jerusalem. Cyrus the Great has allowed them to rebuild, and Darius will continue it. But Ezra comes back, and most of the Israelites weren't actually exiled. It was just the leadership and the elites, right? So the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, were living there, and they married other folks. And Ezra asserted that they had to divorce their non-Israelite wives. So one possible context, if it wasn't written in that day, a context in which this would be used potentially would be to push back against Ezra. Because it doesn't say, it says in the law that they should only really marry Israelites. It does really emphasize that. But it never says if you've married a non-Israelite that you should go and divorce them. But it does say Moabites, the archetypal enemy, are not allowed to be in the congregation. But we know of at least one, really prominent one, who was. So you can see how this is a tension of how does this get reconciled? She's a Moabite. We know Ruth is in David's heritage, lineage. So how does this all get reconciled? So that's part of the tension that comes into this. But these very first 5 verses, all of the men get wiped out, literally. Machlon and Chilion die. And so the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay.
To answer your first question, I think the tension is looking for a home where there's enough food.
Yeah, so I think that's a strong theme for sure. Where do we find our home and our resting place? Chesed is that loving kindness. What kind of grace and love is being showed is another really dominant theme. Kathy, that's a good point. I've actually been to several really good sessions and a number of good books that look at Ruth as a migratory experience and what the book of Ruth can say to folks and to communities that are themselves migrants or homeless or communities that are working with such people. So it can be very powerful in that theme as well. All right. So she leaves. Chapter 1 continues that with Naomi getting word that the famine has been lifted in Israel. So she gets ready to head back. By the way, these images, the ones that are sort of almost look like pencil drawings, they all come from Queen Mary's Bible from the 14th century, early 14th century. I just thought I'd mention it while it's there. I'm trying to do a better job at keeping track. So she starts to go back, and these two women follow her. And in an area that we could really delve into, we don't really have time now, but it's a great example of where the Bible doesn't tell us things that at least I would like to know. So there's this moment, they're getting ready to go back. Naomi turns and says, I got nothing for you. You know, may Yahweh bless you, but, you know, go. So you've dealt kindly with me. Your husband's died. You've stayed by my side to take care of me while I've been in Moab. Now I'm leaving. You don't need to stick with me. You've done all that you may. I pray I'll leave. This will open up the opportunity for you to have another husband, right? No, we'll return with you to your people. And Naomi says, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. So she tries to push them back completely, and she's just done. She's just done. She's got nothing. Theoretically, there's Levirate marriage, where if there was yet another brother, he would be obliged to marry one or actually, I don't think it ever addresses the possibility of marrying both, but one. But she says, go back. Now Orpah does. Orpah turns and goes back, but Ruth does not. And in terms of sort of the gaps, it's why wouldn't Ruth go back? Do you all have any thoughts? I mean, there's a gap in the text. The text doesn't tell us this. This is one of these things that I would love to know, but the Bible doesn't tell us. What are your thoughts?
Maybe she thought she would do better to stay with her mother-in-law than to go back to her own people.
Right, and why? Why do you think that might be the case? You're thinking along the same lines I do.
I'm not sure about that, whether the food would have been plentiful in the country where she would have gone back to. I'm just not sure.
Well, think about this, right? The Moabites were the enemies of the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Israelites were the enemies of the Moabites. It could well be that Ruth's family and Naomi's family were not very happy with them for having married Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Maybe Ruth doesn't have any family left. Orpah goes back, but Ruth, there is some reason. Now, ordinarily, in a very positive way, you'll read commentaries talking about, and this chesed that Boaz will talk about with regard to Ruth, this commitment to Naomi, this deep abiding love for her. Some modern commentators want to see a queer relationship here. I don't see any evidence in the text for it textually, but I understand the way in which it can be appropriated in that way. But there's also probably a really strong possibility, at least if we sort of place it in a historical context and think about, okay, what would this life be? Ruth probably just isn't welcome or doesn't have a home to go back to. Naomi is all she has. That doesn't mean she might not be truly and devotedly committed to Naomi, but there's also, there's less to go back to, or presumably she would have, like Orpah would have. But it is something to think about where we don't have the answers. And it's something I was telling my student, I'm doing a summer course on this with the student right now in preparation for the fall class. And I was telling Maya, it has taken me a while to broaden out a little bit. I mean, my tendency and my training is, if it's not in the text, it's irrelevant. If it's not in the text, we can't read it into the text. We can't do it. But over the years, I've begun to realize not only the fact that these are living texts for a living community, Jewish, Christian, and others, and so they're going to appropriate and adapt and so forth. But those gaps are just so interesting to me. You know, what did Cain say to Abel? There's this lacuna in the text, a gap in the text. We don't know.
Christian, I've always just assumed that she looked at her mother-in-law as an old lady who was vulnerable, traveling by herself, and didn't want her to do that.
And it could be as simple as that. But in order to do that, there was no greater pull for her to remain in Moab, right?
That's true. No, I think what you're saying is true. I'm not disagreeing with you. I think I never thought of it the way you just explained it. But it just impressed me that her heart went out to Naomi.
Well, absolutely. And I it's funny, I'm in a lot of discussions right now, completely unrelated to this and university matters, where I have to point out to people, just because we say one thing doesn't mean the other is not also true.
Right.
Kathy, I think that there is clearly that aspect of it, but I also think it shows the vulnerability of Ruth that you were touching on earlier, right? That she is very much without a home, it seems.
Uh-huh.
Because, one of the things she could have done, she could have paid, they could potentially have paid for a man to accompany Naomi, or she could have gone with Naomi to make sure she's settled and then have somebody bring her back safely, and things like there are ways you could do that if she felt a draw back to her home.
Yeah.
But she did not feel enough of a draw there to do so.
Yeah.
Christian,
Yeah.
what about the line that says, "May the Lord do thus and so to me"? So I wonder if there's a spiritual commitment too, that maybe she believes in Naomi's God.
Great, Joyce. So let's look at this. So then after Ruth says, "I'm going to stay with you," Naomi turns, she sees that Ruth is still there, and she goes, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return to your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." So this has been appropriated for marriage vows in lesbian weddings, oftentimes. And it is this commitment. Now, as Joyce was alluding to, the question comes up, is this a kind of conversion experience for Ruth? And people will use that term. The challenge with that is it's a very modern, well, I can't say that. For Iron Age Israel, the setting we're in, that there's not quite that notion of conversion that we have even by the time of Jesus and Paul, right? So look more closely again. What is she saying? What is at the heart of Ruth's statement here?
An oath?
An oath, and Kathy, to your earlier point, an oath to whom? She's making the oath before the Lord, Yahweh, but who is?
To Naomi.
To Naomi. Right. And one of the things in antiquity that we don't know, unless somebody like me teaches us, is that when you went to another, gods were viewed as geographical. This is one of the radical things of the biblical revelation, because in Egypt, you've got your Egyptian gods. You worship the Egyptian gods. When you're in Canaan, you worship the Canaanite gods, because that's their turf. And if you want to thrive and succeed in that area, then you need to give them what they deserve. Think about it like a local government, right? You know, if I go live in the UK, I have to pay taxes in the UK. I've got to abide by their laws and their mores. And so when Ruth was going with Naomi to Israel, her saying that your God will be my God is a kind of adoption, right? She's acknowledging, I'm committed to staying there. It may not, and I would argue is probably not, in fact, a faith statement, like I have come to believe that Yahweh is the one true God. It's probably just more like, where you lodge, I will lodge. Wherever you're going to live, I'm going to live. And because I'm going to be with you, I'm tethering myself to you, your God will be my God. So on the one hand, I want to sort of shift it out of our notions of conversion. But at the same time, I don't want you to think I'm diminishing her commitment to Yahweh. Because after she says, your God will be my God, she does say, may Yahweh do thus and so to me and more as well. That is a classic oath. So she is acknowledging that Yahweh is a God who can seal an oath, is strong and mighty. We got one more person to admit. What's your reaction to that, to what I just said?
I think it's very serious what she says. I mean, and Naomi even sees that. She goes like, okay, I'm not going to argue with you then.
Yeah.
It's
Joy? Yeah.
Very serious.
Good. And Joyce? I can't see everybody at once, so just chime in if you all want to say anything.
I thought there was something she saw, possibly even in their marriage and with their sons, that led her to believe there was a better life instead of staying there, whether it was a combination of a God or just a better way.
Yeah. It's possible, I will say, and we're not going to emphasize it, but in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, and actually the theme that comes out, this is why the loving kindness, chesed, is often talked about. Ruth, the women of the city, Boaz, Boaz says, everybody knows about you, Ruth, when he meets her on the field. Everybody knows about you because of this loving kindness that you have done to Naomi. So it is possible. I mean, they were there they were in Moab for 10 years. How long the boys were married before they died is not clear. But, Ruth would have had an Israelite husband for a number of years, and presumably they were still worshiping Yahweh. So it's not like this is out of the blue. So there may be some element of that, for sure. But what does this do? So when I mentioned there's this tension, we have a Moabite entering into the congregation of Israel. This resolves that tension in a way, doesn't it? Because she is now effectively an Israelite. Now, quickly, I will tell you, in rabbinic literature, a couple of things happen. One is there's a lovely little play, grammatical play. So in Numbers, in Hebrew, you have masculine and feminine gender for nouns. And so Moavim, when it says in Numbers that the Moabites will not be allowed in, it's Moavim, the masculine. And so Boaz says, the spirit of prophecy has told me that when God said that, it referred only to the men, not to the women. And then in the Talmud, this passage, so in the Targum, in the Aramaic version of Ruth, so Aramaic versions, these Targum, the Targum is a translation, word for word of the Hebrew, but then it will stick other things into it. other material, dialogue, and so forth. This soliloquy of Ruth's becomes a dialogue with Naomi, and it actually becomes a catechesis, where Naomi pushes back and she responds. So if you think about the renewal of our baptismal vows, will you renounce all evil? I will renounce all evil. It's exactly that kind of structure. So by the time we get to the 1st century CE, conversion is now what we tend to think of conversion, leaving one religion or one way of life to take on another. And then by the time you get to the 5th, 6th century, that Aramaic version comes into the Talmud. This very passage becomes the standard. This is the way you convert to Judaism in the rabbinic period, is Ruth's words. So this is what reconciles that tension about how you can have a Moabite in David's lineage. You can have the Moabite because she has taken this on. She has fully committed. She's not some cuckoo's egg in the nest. She is truly an Israelite now. All right, I've taken too long, probably. Oh, we haven't even finished chapter 1. I've taken way too long. I'm sorry. So Naomi gets back. Her name Naomi means pleasant. All the women come out and they're like, "Is this Naomi? She looks pretty rough." And she says, "Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Mara meaning bitter. "I went away full," that is her family, "but the Lord has brought me back empty." So, you've got this famine and fullness and so forth, play going back and forth here. And that follows its way all the way through. Now, notice how depressed she really is, right? She's just like, "I got nothing. I'm bitter." She doesn't even acknowledge the fact that this woman, Ruth, has come with her all the way. She goes, "I got nothing." And so chapter 2 opens with Naomi basically, or chapter 1 closes with Naomi basically in a depression. She's gone back to Bethlehem to die. Well, Ruth's not going to have it. Chapter 1, we get Boaz, we get some foreshadowing to let us know that there is this great man, Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite, by the way, she is almost always identified as the Moabites. The old King James would have Moabitess because it's the feminine form there. So you are not allowed to forget in this narrative that she is a Moabite. And she turns to Naomi and she goes, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She says, "Go, my daughter." So she went. So what I wanted to emphasize here is, chapter 1 is Naomi's story. Hey, kitty cat. Chapter 2, Ruth takes charge. She goes out to the field, and she's not necessarily looking for a hubby. And you can see in the image there, you've got Boaz, who is depicted older because his language, his speech patterns are similar to Naomi's, which are different than Ruth. So he's older than Ruth, probably Naomi's age. So he's pointing, going, "Wait, who's that lady?" So she was just looking for some favor to be able to glean the field, because biblical law required that you leave the corners of the field unharvested for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in your midst, right? As you've heard me preach before, biblical injunctions for caring for the most vulnerable that not all of us in our society today take seriously. But so Ruth knew that she could have these resources. So chapter 3, I just want to jump into this one and then pause. Naomi steps up here. So Ruth is still doing everything in this passage, but Naomi gives her the guidance. So chapter 2 is largely just she's gleaning, and she meets Boaz. He gives her some extra bits, and when she goes back, Naomi, this is what Naomi says to her: "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you." So Naomi's starting to come out of this depression. She's like, you know what? You've been amazing to me. I need to find some security for you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz. with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now, everybody knows what that is. It's when you've got the grain, you've got the husk, the shell, and the kernel. You toss it up in the air, especially in the evening or in the early morning when there's a breeze. Toss it up, and the shaft gets blown away, and then the grains fall back down. And when you're threshing like that, when you're winnowing the wheat, you would then can take several days. So you would sleep by your grain so that people wouldn't come and steal and rob from you, right? So they're going to be out there in the fields. Now Ruth, wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she said to her, all that you tell me, I will do. And she more or less does. It's interesting to see the sort of nuances she makes on her own. But does anybody know the titillating aspect of this story? Who was it said they took systematic theology?
I did.
Mac, did you ever get this?
You know, it had, from here on, it has a lot of sexual overtones.
Do you remember why?
Feet feet or not?
Uncovering his feet had to do with uncovering his genitals.
Right. Harriet, were you chiming in there?
Feet aren't exactly feet.
Right. So the Hebrew term is regulaim, which means feet, but it's also the euphemism for the pudenda, for the genitals, for both men and women, by the way. So what do you think is actually going on in the scene?
So is this about Ruth?
Yes.
So do you think she is uncovering the things on the bottom of his legs, or do you think she's pulling that up a little bit higher? And why?
I don't think we know.
I think we can have some security in a particular answer, but if we think about it literarily, this is engaging and enticing in a story. If we all know Hebrew and we're hearing this story, and it's like, go and uncover his feet. What? What did she just say? Suddenly you're paying attention to that story in a way that you might not have otherwise. Now, the reason I think we can say that she wasn't messing around with his potty bits is because of, actually, let me see. I can't remember if I gave that to you. Yep, there we go. So notice his reaction. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth," etc. So he just kind of wakes up. Now, anybody ever play the game where you've got a friend who's sleeping and you put their hand in a thing of warm water and they're supposed to urinate?
Yeah.
If you literally just uncover somebody's feet when they're sleeping outside, eventually their feet get cold and they're going to wake up, or they're going to surface in their sleep, right? The whole point of Naomi's setup for Ruth was to have a private conversation with Boaz so that her reputation, so that people don't think she's skulking around. One could argue, too, that she is at the same time putting Boaz in a bit of a compromising situation. She is there in the middle of the night, after all, to see him. But I think that I think in the literal sense, the uncovering of the feet is actually a really clever way, because if she kind of shook him awake, he's likely to go, what? And wake up his men who are all around him. So that's why I think there is the tension. To that sense, it's never resolved so that we pay attention to the story. But I also think there's a sense in which the literal sense is functioning there. It's a really clever way to wake somebody up without them waking everybody else up. What do you think about my reading?
I like it.
Yeah. You all are welcome to disagree.
That's Ken Murphy who said that.
Yeah.
I like it better than what I've thought for a long time.
Okay.
I'm happy to have it kind of vague, as to the sexual part, but I like the way you explained it.
Yeah, I mean, the innuendo is there intentionally. There's no question of that, right? Harriet's right, and Mac, the Hebrew allows this to be the case, but yeah, I think that's there because also Boaz is really, so remember, we don't have any ceremonies for weddings in the Bible. The closest we get is that they have coitus, right? They say in front of everybody, we're going to be man and wife, husband and wife, and the man takes his new wife into, in Genesis, it's his mother's tent. I've always thought that was a little creepy, but they go into the tent together. There you go. That seems to be what makes you husband and wife. Boaz could have consummated in that moment. And could have just said, you're right. And, and by the way, the other euphemism that's in here, I am Ruth, your servant, spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. Again, that is, on the surface can be viewed as metaphorical, right? Offer your protection to me. I need your protection. But it also could be quite literal,
I like it.
Put your cloak over me. Here we go. Let's consummate this right now. And Boaz stops, right? He says, wait, there's actually someone who is closer to you in terms of redeeming you. I want to do this, but there is somebody who is close to next of kin. So if he'll do that, great, let him do it. If he's not willing, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. So lie down until the morning. Then there's a whole thing where he makes sure she gets up before anybody can recognize who's who. She carries away this amazingly large amount of grain, which is probably a textual error, but it makes it sound like she's carrying about 400 pounds worth of grain. Maybe not quite that much. I can't remember how much an ephah weighs. But so there are reasons. So the tension is there in both cases. Now, I will say this, and please just interrupt me. There's so much I want to say, and I don't have time, but I need to address what you have. But I will say this. One of the interesting things I found in all of my work is there are, to my reading, this is a very women-focused text. And I think that's a pretty straightforward reading, as I suggested earlier. It is all about the women. It's about Naomi. It's about Ruth. Now, it's about securing their place in a patriarchal society. It's about securing the lineage. Ultimately, at the end, we find out, that there is this connection to David. That's all dudes, right? But what really has surprised me is how many modern feminist scholars will look at Boaz, and then there's one pair of scholars in particular. They just make Boaz into this creepy older predatory man and all the things that he's doing, so forth and so on. And what they've done is they've robbed the story from the women, even as they call themselves feminist scholars, because Boaz is a marginal character in this story. I actually put it in writing. I don't know if you all are familiar with the modern use of the phrase to refer to a person as a tool. So a tool is somebody who is just a jerk and just an object. They're there just to perform a function, and that's it. I actually, in an article, refer to Boaz as a tool because he's a nice guy, but he is here solely to provide the protection and the necessary seed, to be blunt about it. But narratively, right? Why does Boaz act?
She chose him because she chose him.
Well, because she acted, right, Kathy?
Yeah.
Right? Apparently, she'd been gleaming for quite some time. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi saying, the man in whose fields, with whose women you've been working in the field. So she's been doing this for a while. We know from chapter 2, Boaz knows who she is, knows the family relationship. Clearly, he knows this other guy. He's just hanging back. If he wanted to be the hero, he could have acted earlier, right?
Well, he thinks he's too old for her, or that she would think that he's too old for her.
How do you know without asking? But my point is, he doesn't take any initiative, right?
No.
And so within the narrative, remember, we're talking about how we read the Bible. The women drive the whole thing, don't they? So I felt I needed to, yeah, sorry. I'll shut up now.
He does kind of stick up for her, though. Say, do
Absolutely.
this, drink water here and sit by me. And he does some nice things for her. But
Oh, Boaz is a good guy. I'm not denigrating Boaz. All I'm saying is within the story is driven by the women. They're the actors.
Yeah, I agree.
Christian Kathleen Farmer says that the word redeem and redeemer is used throughout this text. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it is. So where it says next of kin is the Hebrew goel, which is the word to redeem. And what it means here, and there are legal issues with the book of Ruth, which really won't get into. So on the one hand, it looks like Ruth, the discussion in the book here is about what we would call levirate marriage, right? From the Latin for brother-in-law. And so the idea being that Boaz would he's the nearest kinsman, be able to redeem. So when it says next of kin, it really is, sometimes you'll see the phrase kinsman redeemer. It's a goel. And the idea is that he would marry and produce the child, and that firstborn male child born would not be his, but would be Machlon's, in order to continue Elimelech's name in the tribe, right? Machlon, Elimelech, and so forth. But it gets confused as well with the property. So chapter 4 starts with Boaz going to meet, and this fellow is referred to as Ploni Almani, which is often translated so-and-so. It's kind of a nonsense word in Hebrew. And so-and-so is sort of the way, what's his head, I might say, right? He doesn't have a name. He's that guy. And he initially is like, oh yeah, I'll redeem it, thinking it's all about property. And Boaz says, okay, now if you're going to take the property, then you've got to take this Moabite woman, Ruth, as well. I was like, oh, I can't do that. So Mac, when it talks about redemption here, it's a familial and a material redemption. It is a fulfilling of the law to ensure that these things, both the name and the property, would continue within the tribe and the clan. But by the same token, there is a broader sense. If we combine that with the theme of chesed, of loving kindness, there is the broader sense there as well. You think about the fact that chapter 3 opens with Naomi saying, I need to ensure your security. So if we're preaching on this, we can begin to move out a little bit and talk in bigger, broader terms, as several of you were talking about, in terms of security, in terms of a sense of place or home. So we can begin to allegorize just a little bit out from it, but that's where that term, you never thought you were going to get that much when you mentioned Redeemer, did you? So this is our last slide, because we're right at the end of our time. But chapter 4 is all about, we could call it Boaz's story, because that's the one chapter where he takes action. But the book again comes around and it ends with the women. So he goes to the city gate. You have this odd giving of the shoe, glove, and so forth. But ultimately Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. So I didn't even mention, by the way, one of the reasons Ruth and Orpah might feel they had no place at home, over a number of years of being married, they never had children. So they would have been viewed as barren. So that's why it emphasizes the Lord made Ruth to conceive in this union. But then notice who becomes Obed's nurse. We again have more ambiguity because he laid him on Naomi's bosom and she became his nurse. Was she literally suckling him?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
How many grandmothers do we have on the call, right? Yeah, there you go. But I think that there is an ambiguity because notice the women of the neighborhood said a son has been born to Naomi, not to Ruth, not even to Machlon or Elimelech, right? It's Naomi. Yeah, it ends with the genealogy. Obed became the father of Jesse, became the father of David. But this is the women's story. So, any thoughts? Any closing remarks? I've actually kept more or less to time this time.
Just one thing, Christian.
Please.
I like Eugene's message, the message.
Yeah.
His
Peterson.
interpretation of next of kin is covenant redeemer, and I like that phrase.
It's a nice phrase. It's problematic to me. You know, Peterson's work, and I've gotten into some heated discussions with people in the past. It is a paraphrase, as he acknowledges. Yeah. I've just, every now and then, some folks haven't always been willing to acknowledge it. And so he's putting a broader context. So the term brit is not in there, covenant. And so by inserting the word covenant with redeemer, which covenant are we talking about? How does that get read? And if we're a Christian community reading that, we might impose some broader meanings and some very New Testament meanings of covenant into this that are not originally there in the story.
Sure.
But there is no doubt that it is about covenantal relationships, right? Marriage is a covenant. This relationship that Ruth and Naomi has is covenantal because she made this commitment to Naomi when she decided to go with her. And she joined into the covenant with Israel that God has made. So there are many layers. My concern would just be, well, there's a linguistic concern as to what's present in the text versus not, but that to make sure we unpack that even further then. But it draws out lots of additional imagery for sure.
It does.
I have a comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
After you, Joyce.
A son has been born to Naomi. And as a grandmother myself, I feel like my grandchildren are my kids.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there wasn't a custom at that time too, that everyone born after Naomi was Naomi's.
Well, I mean, I think those personal feelings would be there. But remember, chapter 4, the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4, ostensibly are all about these legal issues of redemption, covenant redemption, as we were just saying. And so to have the women make that statement in that way undercuts the ostensible Levirate marriage, the idea that this is intended so that Elkanah's name might, Elimelech's name might continue. And yet his name, we never hear his name again. We hear Naomi's. So I certainly, I think, Joyce, there's no question about the warmth and the joy of a grandparent. But I think literarily, there's a statement being made by the author here. Who has made this possible? Naomi and Ruth. They're the ones who have persevered through famine of all sorts.
In the Lord also. Christian, do you think that it could be bookending that speech that Naomi made when she said, "I have no more sons in my womb"?
Oh, for sure. Because you've got this sort of chorus of women from the neighborhood who come in at the end. They were there in that end of chapter 1, and this is an inclusio, is what we call it literarily. Absolutely.
I have a comment that's sort of on a broader scale, but I'm in Hendry's Tuesday morning Bible study, and I am racking my brain for the reference, but we're studying the book of John, the Gospel of John, and someone said, well, there we go again. The women are the ones, I can't think of what we were talking about, but the women are the ones who are kind of giving all, and the men are the ones, holding back and questioning or whatever. Anyway, I was thinking about that, and I thought, well, the deal is that women really have nothing to lose in a lot of cases. They already have nothing. I mean, they don't have property. And in this case, it's similar, that Naomi and Ruth have nothing to lose. And so they are willing to take great risks. I mean, it was a great risk to do what she did. And that is, damn, I wish I could think of that example in the gospel that where, the women, it's just, that's the way I look at it. Not that women are taken advantage of, or it's sort of a reverse blessing, that they have the opportunity because they have the freedom, more freedom in some ways than men do throughout these Bible stories, because they got nothing to lose.
Yeah, Harry, that is certainly one way to look at it, right? If you have nothing else, you might as well dive into it. One of the things I would say, again, if I were to pull back from the text of Ruth a little bit, and I were preaching this for our community, one of the things I would say, though, is while they in some ways have nothing to lose because they are the most vulnerable of the community, at the same time, Ruth and Naomi, and even Ruth has learned, they know that in the Israelite society, in God's society, the widow and the orphan are supposed to be taken care of. There is supposed to be remnants in the field for them to glean. There is a kinsman redeemer who is supposed to make good that portion of the familial and a clan covenant. And so it's the women standing up and saying, these are our rights. These are the things we don't expect much because we're here on this margin, but at least give us that because it's there. And that's where I would then, like I said, lean into it and say, that's what minorities and disenfranchised in our community are doing. And those of us who are claimed to be upholding our Constitution, our biblical faith, need to acknowledge those commitments we've made in the past and that they extend to all of these folks. But I got to preach in there and I apologize. So. Do we have any other final comments? I don't want to keep you from Hendry in the service. I think there was one other comment in the middle, wasn't there? No? Well, I appreciate our time as always. We've got Samuel next week. There are remarkably few images of Samuel, to be honest with you, in these manuscripts. We're going to look at the beginning of 1 Samuel. We're going to look at the calling of young child Samuel and his mother Hannah bringing him. I love the scene where so Elkanah, that's why I keep saying Elkanah instead of Elimelech and Ruth. Elkanah, who was Samuel's dad, had 2 wives, Hannah, whom he loved the most, but she was barren, and Peninnah, who had 2 children, and they go up to the tabernacle. There's not a temple yet. And Hannah, it's seemingly our first account of personal prayer. Hannah's praying to herself to God, and Eli thinks she's drunk because he's never seen this before. But she's asking for God's intervention, and God delivers, and she makes good on her vow to dedicate Samuel to be a servant of God. So let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.